Hello, and welcome back to the next episode of this Healthy Life podcast. I'm very excited for my guest today. I have Dr. Morgan Stanley, who is a doctor of physical therapy with a background in track and field, football, and ultimate. He combines his expertise in exercise science with a passion for helping clients become lifelong athletes and guiding them through chronic pain management and performance programming. Morgan, welcome today. I'm very excited to have you here.
Absolutely happy to be here.
Awesome. So let's start with a little bit of an intro about yourself, some of your background, and how you got into being a doctor of physical therapy.
Yeah, absolutely. As you mentioned, sports were always a part of my life. I went to Florida State originally, attempted to work with a track and field team. Unfortunately, they were just quite a bit better than me. So I ended up playing on the club ultimate team there for 4 years, which was one of the best experiences of my life. While I was there, studied exercise science, and then eventually worked my way into PT school at the University of St. Augustine in Austin, Texas. Was there for about 5 years, then moved out here about a year and a half ago to work at Monarch Athletic Club.
Awesome. And that's where we've met. So,
yes, absolutely.
You know, when I joined Monarch, I was like, oh, there's a PT program, but I'm not ever going to need it. I'm not ever going to use it. And here I am. I've been working with you for 3-4 months now through all my surgeries. So yeah, I've had a couple surgeries this year, which is something I'm going to talk about on the podcast and the blog here soon. But, you know, most people think PT, you go in and you like lay on a table and someone stretches you and adjusts you. And, you know, when I came back into the gym, I was like, there's no way I'm going to go back into like what I was doing before. And it was so crazy that within a week we were like lifting weights again and doing exercises. So I'd love for you to share a little bit about kind of that approach with PT and how it can be more active and kind of like rehabbing you with different workouts.
Absolutely. I think that's one of the things that's probably most misconstrued about physical therapy as a whole is just the more passive nature of it. Like you said, the massage, the e-stim, the ultrasound, things like that. And there's a time and place for some of those things. But people who have active goals need active interventions, right? So I know you were someone who prior to your procedures had been coming in 4 or 5 days a week pretty consistently for 7-8 months.
Yeah.
And those are your goals to get back to doing the things you were doing before. And being on a table isn't going to help you get to those goals. So using those first couple sessions to kind of set a baseline of where you or whatever patient's in front of me is at, and then building a pretty comprehensive strength program from there. Whole thing is trying to get people moving as much as they can, as soon as they can tolerate. And that's something that takes a little bit of practice, a little honing into, but the whole idea is get you off the table as soon as you can and really empower you to show you what you're capable of when you may think that you're not quite there yet.
Yeah. And that's a great point you bring up. So like, how do you work through people's kind of like mental roadblocks? Because I remember when you were like, okay, we're going to go do these squats and like lift this. I was like, wait, what? I'm like, I can't even like put my arms up to ponytail my own hair. Like, how am I going to lift weights? So like, I mean, for me, I definitely had kind of like a mental block of like, I'm not ready. You're going to hurt me. But actually, to my surprise, it actually helped me like move forward. So how do you deal with people's kind of like mental blocks and not feeling ready to do that kind of active work yet?
Absolutely. And it's something that you really have to know the person in front of you. And that's why I like to spend, like I said, the first session or two, like it's a lot of talking, maybe a lot of sometimes things on the table, range of motion assessments, strength assessments, just seeing kind of where we're at, what we can tolerate at each joint. I remember when you first came back, we were really focused on the lower extremities, and those are the ones that are the most painful. So I knew squatting would be a little bit of a challenge. So based upon the available range of motion you had on the table, I just kind of said, okay, we can do like partial range of motion squats, see how those feel. And you just start there. Like it's always easy to kind of start easy and you can add things later. But if you add things too much right away, then you're going to get a little more sore, a little irritated, and
scare people off,
and then you get mad at me. So, but yeah, you just kind of got to take the person in front of you and know what their risk level is too. Some people are more catastrophizers. If something hurts, it really scares them, which I understand. Can be a scary thing. And some people really just want to push it all the way all the time, and you kind of got to reel them in. So you need to really know the person in front of you, and using those first session or two to really gauge that can kind of help steer what type of mental gymnastics you have to do with the person, whether it's pulling them in or pushing them just a little bit more and showing them what they're capable of.
Absolutely. Great. So can you talk about some of like the approaches? So I know, you know, like if you have a joint injury, like with my knees, like I had like a lot of like mobility issues, like being able to bend my knees and even go upstairs. And then, you know, when we did my upper arms, like the elbows, it was like more like a tendon issue. And I was surprised that actually like using more weight was actually what was going to fix it, where you have this pain and you're just like, no, I can't lift anything. Like, but it actually really made a big improvement just within a few days. So what are some different approaches that you do when it's more like a joint injury versus like a tendon injury, and how do you approach those sorts of things?
Absolutely. And I think the big picture of it all is that we're just trying to make that joint a better joint. I stole that from Dr. Katie Dabrowski. She's out of Miami, but she's like, what we've learned as we've kind of gone away from the biomedical model of pain, thinking that one specific tissue is causing damage, we want to just treat the joint as a joint. Now, if it is pretty pinpoint, like your elbow was, like near a tendon insertion, and it seemed more on a muscle or tendon versus kind of in a joint or like behind the kneecap itself, it can change how we want to load it. So for the knee, for instance, when it's more that a joint that's angry or irritated, we probably want to do a little lighter weight and higher reps just to kind of
get it moving.
Yeah, get it moving. Just groove the joint a little bit, groove that pattern, and just get it comfortable moving through its full range of motion again. If you remember when you were working on your knee too, we were doing a lot of tempos and pauses, and just getting comfortable in those bottom positions, in those formerly uncomfortable positions, or staying just above them, and kind of retraining not only the joint but the brain as well, that it's safe, it's going to be okay, and just spending a little bit of time there. Exactly. We're not going to break one. Our knee's not just going to explode.
Sometimes it feels like it is.
Yes. But it's not, and just kind of, again, retraining the brain, the person, and the joint that it's going to be okay, and just gaining time under tension in those positions. With your elbow and with tendons specifically, muscles and tendons, their whole job is to move and transfer load, move bones, transfer load between joints. So when it comes to rehabbing those, the best way to do that is typically actively with weight. We know that tendons, the research, really like heavy, slow loads. It just allows them to just really do their job, and they're really sensitive to speed. So if we can take the speed out of the equation but still give them a decent load stimulus, it can one, help with pain, but also just help them get a little bit stronger to do their job better. And so that's what we found pretty quickly once we added some heavy eccentric.
I couldn't believe it. Like within like what, a week or two, like I was like, wow, it feels like almost pretty much normal after. I mean, I think I had like an old injury in there that probably got activated from like the swelling and stuff from my surgery. So it's like, but now it feels like it has like nothing going on. So it's been pretty amazing.
I think tendon rehab is something that I've really enjoyed, because it is a way to introduce people to heavier loads that they may be reluctant to. So someone like yourself who, like you said, like heavy weights are going to make this better. And the bias of mine is to lift heavy weights. But if it's a way to show them what they can do, even in the presence of pain, that it's actually going to make it better. It's just a better way to get people more comfortable with strength training, even in the presence of some pain or discomfort.
Absolutely. And so are there other like supportive therapies that you recommend? So, you know, like obviously you're going to be doing kind of like a more active form of PT, maybe some work on the table, but are there other things you recommend, like acupuncture or, you know, massage therapy or anything like that that can be supportive when people are recovering from an injury?
Absolutely. I think fill your big buckets first. So for me, your sleep, nutrition, and then getting in your exercise. I think everyone at Monarch is pretty big on the physical activity guidelines. So making sure that we're hitting aerobic, 150 to 300 minutes of aerobic work per week, and then minimum 2 resistance training things per week. Once those are hit, those are going to be the things that really propel you to have some longevity and add some quality to those later years of life. But everything else to supplement that, massage, acupuncture, especially if you've had success with those in the past, I love them.
It's not going to hurt, right?
It's not going to hurt. It's not going to hurt anything. It can only help. So I recommend those, especially if people are maybe a little more sore, things feeling a little bit tender, especially if it's a new weight training program. But I want to make sure that we're trying to get our big buckets in first, and then we can kind of supplement those kind of around the program. But I really like acupuncture. In Texas, I was dry needling certified. And so I would do that quite a bit for people who had some chronic pain, or maybe were just a little dinged up from whatever weekend warrior activity they were participating in. So it can definitely be something I do either initially, or if I've been working for them a long time and I know that they've had success with it in the past. But usually I try to at least pair that with some type of active intervention afterwards, even if it is doing a little more hands-on massage therapy, and then getting them to work on whatever muscle I was just trying to work out.
And then are there other recovery things that you like to integrate as well? So I know like with my program, like we've been doing strength training, we do some cardio, but we do like a lot of mobility and stuff just to make sure those joints are still kind of like opening up and working and not getting too tight, right? So are there other things that you recommend, like restorative wise, that can help people kind of recover more quickly as they're reintegrating back into their workouts?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the mobility piece is something that can be a little bit of a hot button topic. If you've seen me move, I'm not the most mobile person, so you don't need a ton of mobility, but that's person dependent, right? If someone has goals to be more mobile, or someone wants to do yoga or Pilates that require a little bit more mobility, then that's something we can definitely work on. And I also think of mobility as a piece that the more movement options we have, the more variability we have, and we're less likely to overuse or overload certain areas of our body. So that's why I like doing the mobility piece, making sure that especially someone like yourself who after some of the procedures were a little bit restricted in certain movements,
Very
whether the
stiff.
shoulder, stiff, and the hips, knees, shoulders.
Yeah.
We add those in just to make sure we are addressing like getting our body to do what it's made to do, move through all those degrees of freedom that those joints allow us. And the mobility piece can be a good, very important part of that. And also, like I said, like for me, I think about things in the lens of not overloading the tissues. So the more options we have, the more we can disperse that force in whatever we're trying to do, whether it's even something like box jumps or squats. Like the more options we have, the more variability we have, and the more we can distribute those forces to the appropriate tissues versus overloading a hip, back, something like that.
Awesome. And then, so when you're working with patients, what's the most common, or maybe like the top 3 most common injuries that you see on your table?
Most common that I see at Monarch, I see a lot of low back pain. But that's 80,
me.
Yeah. But 80% of people, adults worldwide, will experience low back pain at one point in life. So that's pretty common, just ubiquitously amongst the adult population. So I think if you ask most PTs, that's what we see a lot of. And that's number one. And then every now and then we got some weekend warrior people, a lot of tennis, pickleball, so some shoulders and maybe some knees as well. But that's probably the big thing: back pain, shoulder, knee, and then from there you can kind of differentially diagnose like more what you think is going on. But those are the big 3.
Okay, awesome. So you talk about something called the Goldilocks effect.
Yes.
And so can you talk a little bit about what that means and like how you treat someone that is experiencing that?
Yes. Yeah. So the Goldilocks effect is, I mean, just like the fable says, it's like you want to find that sweet spot. You don't want to do too much where we're making the person super sore or possibly overdoing where they're at for
making them worse.
Exactly, making them worse, flaring them up, either causing them swelling in the knee, shoulder, whatever it may be. But we also don't want to do too little. And I think that's where a lot of physical therapists, unfortunately, lies. We do too little. People may feel good because they're not really challenging the system enough. So the Goldilocks effect and the Goldilocks zone really is finding the effective dose that can kind of manifest change, but without flaring them up and without like leaving them not really doing enough to create a physiological change or adaptation to get them towards what they want to do.
It's always like you want to be sore for about a day. If you're sore more than that, then you probably overdid it a little bit too much, right? So is that like a good baseline? I mean, even when you're not doing PT, even when you're just working out, is that a good baseline to use, or should people be pushing themselves a little bit more when they're healthy and don't have an injury?
I think if you're sore for about 24 to 36 hours, that's a kind of a safe range to be, especially if it's something new that's pretty expected. I think that's something that, and we can talk about that too in pain a little bit, but is that not all pain's bad. It's just, it's information and it's a data point, right? I'm not saying it can't be scary at times, but if you're really sore in a joint or anything for 24 to 36 hours, usually it's okay. If it persists a little bit longer than that, or it's accompanied with a good bit of swelling, then maybe we need to look at what we did and either take off some weight or decrease the volume a little bit, being the sets and reps. But being sore for 24 to 36 hours, especially in the rehab context, I think is okay. And it means that we probably stress the system just enough to get a change we want. That's why we're sore. And we didn't do too little where you don't feel anything at all. And it just slows down the healing process.
Absolutely. And speaking of the healing process, so inflammation is like one way that the body really heals, right? So how do you manage, inflammation and swelling that's happening to kind of heal the joint naturally versus like additional inflammation and swelling you're adding in from the workouts? Is it just kind of finding that sweet spot where you're producing just enough extra inflammation to heal, or how do you kind of manage that for patients? That's
a great question, because it really depends on what the patient's seeing me for. So if someone, say that's post-operative with a knee injury, ACL rehab, when we start doing things like our return to run programs and start being a little more aggressive there, we want what we call which is a quiet knee, where we don't want too much swelling afterwards. A little soreness, okay, but we don't want to balloon up. That's a big sign we probably did too much. Again, not that we hurt anything, but it's kind of that we went on the upper end of that Goldilocks effect. With someone who is coming in and doesn't have any joint swelling, if it really swells up afterwards, then we probably did too much as well. But if it poofs up a little bit and maybe it's a little irritated for that 24 to 36 hours, but it's not this big bulbous grapefruit looking thing on your ankle, knee, whatever, then it's usually part of the body's just natural healing process. I mean, the same thing can be said for like muscles when we're working them out, right? And we get a pump after a gym session, they swell up a little bit and it's part of their healing process as well. So it just depends on the joint, really what the injury is that the person's coming to see me for. But if it looks like too much swelling and it's really warm, it's probably too much swelling. And at that point, we need to reevaluate.
Scale
scale it back a little bit, and kind of reevaluate exactly what we did and change some dosage variable.
So people that say don't have an injury, or like, I mean, everyone's probably prone to injury at some point in their life and workout, right? So what are things that people can do to kind of maintain like a good balance in their body to not injure themselves? Obviously not overdoing it like we talked about, but what are some other key things as people are working out that they can be mindful of to make sure that they're not getting themselves into a chronically injured state?
Absolutely. I think the biggest thing, and again, I'm stealing this from Katie, because I just said a seminar she did, but is most injuries or aches and pains are some type of training variable. And that goes for people who even aren't training. So jumping into some workout program you just found online that might be too high volume, it's going to leave your knees, shoulders, hips feeling cranky. I'm not saying don't go exercise, because I want everyone to do that. But at the same time, like monitoring the program and monitoring your volume. Something's better than nothing. So start small, and so you can stack those little wins is what I usually tell people. So even if it's just doing one set of squats, one set of push-ups, one set of planks, like start there, see how your body feels and responds, and then build on top of that, because that's something that's better than nothing. I think something that I try to use when I'm programming for people as well, especially if they're newer to exercise, is looking at what's called the acute to chronic workload ratio. And you typically don't want it to exceed like 1.5 times what you're doing the week before.
And what is that? What is that exactly?
Yes. So let's use running as an example, just because mileage is easy to do. So let's say you're running and you run 1 mile a week. You're very new. You're getting used to it. You run 1 mile a week.
I probably wouldn't even run a mile.
But it's perfect. So let's say we get you running 1 mile a week, right? The next week you run 2. Well, we now 2x that.
You're going to put this in my program now, aren't you?
Yes, it's going to sneak it in there. Sneak it in. But the idea is that even though these jumps seem small, like we'd go from say 1 mile a week to 2 miles a week, like yes, like that seems small, but you're effectively doubling that stimulus. And if you were to double that stimulus on, say, your deadlifts, your back might be a little sore, your hips might be a little more sore. And the running or any other training variables, the same thing. We want to try to keep it under 1.5 times whatever we were doing the week before. Now, it's not a perfect science, but I think if you have a framework to work off like that, you can easily scale your workouts and your exercises.
Build up safely.
Exactly, based on that, with both total training volume and total load. And that takes into account the intensity of the weight being on the bar and also your sets and reps. And so when I'm programming for people, especially those newer to exercise or returning to exercise, I try to take that into account and not have any big spikes in any one movement pattern or exercise that we're doing.
Okay, so let's talk a little bit about programming. So you do that for a lot of your patients at Monarch, obviously, and like in your own practice. So when you're programming for someone, you use this kind of like 1.5 ratio to scale up, right? And then how do you know when the person's ready to move up? Is it because like based on their level of like soreness or how they felt, or like when do you know they're kind of ready to like keep pushing it?
Both subjectively and objectively. I try to use, as you've probably noticed, I try to use rep ranges for most things. So I try to give like, say, 3 sets, 8 to 10 reps. If we can, say we're starting at dumbbell bench press and we're doing 20 pounds for 8 reps. The next week we do 9, then we do 10. Once we can do all 3 sets or 2 of the 3 sets of that upper end range, then we're probably gonna try to bump it up next week, because you've shown that you can at least handle that for 10 reps. So you can probably handle the 22.5 or the 25s the next week. So, but also to see how you feel with that. If you feel like it's really, really sore afterwards, then maybe in the session that was fine, but it's just causing a little too much, maybe inflammation or soreness afterwards. And so we'll keep it there. But that's typically how I try to progress, is both an objective measure of how do we complete those sets and reps, but also how did you feel doing it? Did it feel really freaking heavy? Because I don't want to make anyone feel unsafe or anything, right? But I also want to make sure we're pushing you and showing you, hey, you did 3 sets of 10 on this last week. Let's try maybe
a little more.
2 sets of 10 at that weight, and then let's do our last set for 8 at the heavier weight.
And that's a great point too, like, because I feel like for me, a lot of times when I'm doing an exercise, I don't feel like the pain, or like it feels okay. Then the next day I'm like, oh, like what did you do to me? Like that was like way too intense. So is that what's more common? Like, do people feel something kind of coming on, or an injury coming on, or that something's like too much in the moment? Or is it usually something that happens later in the day or the next day where you're like, oh, maybe that was a little too much and I didn't feel like it in the moment, but later it did? Like, what's a more common way that you usually start to kind of feel that?
I think the more common one is that delayed soreness. And usually I'm more concerned if it's away from a muscle belly. So if it's more like in the bicep, tricep, like versus like being in the shoulder. Because if it's muscle soreness, typically like it will go away in a day or two. And that's kind of what we're chasing, right? But if it's closer to a joint, like say like in the knee or behind the kneecap, that's when I'm like, okay, there was some mechanical sensitivity there that we may need to change a variable, whether that's the weight we used, the range of motion we used. And I'll kind of go back and see, did we go a lot deeper on squats this week? Did we increase the weight? I try to only change one of those variables at a time. That way we know what was the aggravating factor.
And let's talk about feeling something while you're working out.
Yep.
So I know that there's been a lot of times where I'm like working out, I'm like, oh, that like, I felt that in my knee or I felt that in my elbow. But, you know, I've always been told like, if it's not pain, you're just feeling it. It's okay to kind of push through those things. And I think that's like a big mental block that people have too. Like, especially even me, you know, I'm like working out, I'm like, ooh, like I felt it in my elbow, but they're like, but did it hurt? I'm like, no, it just felt weird or it crackled. And like, can you talk a little bit about that? How kind of like differentiating like when it's okay to kind of push through those feels versus, you know, being when to know like, oh, maybe I should stop or maybe this is aggravating something.
Absolutely.
Because I think that people get caught in their head and anything that you feel, you just want to stop.
It's scary. And like, again, like pain, which is I love talking about pain. It's a scary thing, but it's a exciting thing if you can reframe in the right way. And I think, again, pain to me is information. It's a data point, not to take away the person's pain experience. But if we can change the way we feel about pain from like an emotional thing of it being scary or bad, and we just look at it, okay, it's telling us what we can and can't do right now. So usually what I tell people is it's usually one of two things, but it all goes back to my traffic light analogy. So green light activities are activities that feel good. It's always fine. Like there's no issue there. We're not really even sore afterwards. These are things that usually like say walking, things that are a little less intensive or things that we've done in the past. So
things your body's already kind of used to
exactly.
and, you know, works well for it.
Absolutely. Or the exercise that we really, really love that even if you go super heavy on it, you don't feel anything. Then yellow light is where you feel a little bit of that discomfort, maybe in the knee or the elbow, where it's there and you might not describe it as pain, but it's a little uncomfortable. And it's there, it's talking to you a little bit, but it's not getting worse with each rep of a set that we're doing. And it's not getting worse between sets as well. It's just kind of, okay, it's there, but it leaves once we start resting between sets. That's usually okay. And that's really good to hone in that Goldilocks zone that we were talking about before, is if we can find something that's slightly uncomfortable, but tolerable, usually that's enough of a stimulus
kind of grow
to
and build muscle,
and
right?
adapt.
Yeah.
And that's that safe zone to be in. And then the red light of the traffic light analogy are things that cause like sharp pain, take your breath away type pain. Like if I see someone's face like drastically change in the bottom of a squat or on a dumbbell press when we're working on their shoulder, like that's when I probably know that that's probably too much. And we'll talk about that. Like, and sometimes they'll finish the set and I'm like, yeah, it was really bothering me there. And you could just see the wincing. And that red light pain is probably something that will change one of those variables, whether it's range of motion, weight, something like that, to see if we can make that more into a yellow light activity. And then as we progress, we'll push back into whatever was causing it to be more of a red light one. I think using that frame of reference versus like a 0 to 10 pain scale gives everyone a little bit more ownership of how they're feeling, because everyone interprets pain a little bit differently. I have some people who are doing squats stone face and saying they're at a 9 out of 10 pain. I'm like,
you're like, wait, why didn't you say something?
It's like, we need to go somewhere else if that's the case, because if you're at a 9 out of 10 pain and you have that poker face on, then we got to go to Vegas right now, because that's impressive.
You're like, let's go. Let's go win. Awesome. And then so as people are working out, what are some things that you can recommend to kind of prevent injuries? Like obviously I think using that tool of like the red, yellow, green light is really effective, you know, just for yourself. But what are things that people can do? So like in my experience before I joined Monarch, I was using tonal a lot. And even though it's supposed to kind of like have feedback and show you how to do everything, I was injuring myself all the time. And it was so frustrating because I would do these workouts and finally feel like I was getting strong. And then all of a sudden I'd like tweak my neck and I couldn't work out for like 2 weeks, or, you know, do something else where I just like wasn't standing right and like doing these heavier weights that it was loading me up with. And I was just constantly getting injured. And then like once I started going to Monarch, I think I had a little bit of that fear in the back of my mind, like, oh, if I do too much, I'm going to hurt myself. But like, knock on wood, I haven't gotten injured since working out there. So having someone like really guide me, make sure I'm like bracing correctly and like posture and like doing the exercises correctly has been really helpful. But if someone doesn't have the ability to like work with a trainer every day or have access to that, like what are things that people can do if they are using, say, like tonal at home or like doing home workouts? What are things that they can be aware of to not injure themselves?
Absolutely. I think going right back to that traffic light analogy is listening to your body. It's gonna tell you what's going on. If it feels like too much, whether it's sets, reps, volume, intensity, it might be too much for that given day. I'm not saying, again, don't push yourself. I'm not saying that. But if it's starting to feel like the neck's getting a little tight with certain things, or if you feel like an exercise isn't quite right, either reel it in, either slow it down and decrease the weight, or decrease the range of motion just a little bit. Like you were just saying, if we flare ourselves up enough that we can't really exercise for 2 weeks, we're losing 2 weeks of that time. So if we have to reel it in a little bit just for that day, and take the competition, take the ego out of it a little bit, we'll be able to work out for those 2 weeks and maybe get even stronger, better at whatever it is we were trying to do during those 2 weeks that otherwise we'd have been laid up for. So listen to your body. And again, if it feels like too much, or if it feels like you start feeling more yellow lights than you're probably comfortable with, then there's probably something that needs to be modified. Also, if it's something that's technique wise and you don't have a trainer there with you, I really like people filming themselves. A lot of my online clients, I try to have them film their exercises and send them back in, just one for accountability, but also for a form check. So if I can see that if our squat is really hingy and we're also deadlifting that week, then we're probably doing too much of a hinge pattern, and something that I need to work on from my programming lens and adjust for them so they can get a more adequate stimulus in those two patterns versus overloading the one. So filming yourself and then comparing it to what you want it to look like is a good way, because a lot of times we think we're doing something when we're working out and it looks totally different, myself included, unfortunately.
I know sometimes I feel like I'm doing things correctly and then you're like, no, you like need to do this. I'm like, but I'm doing that. And I'm like, then I like look and I'm like, oh, in the mirror, I'm like, oh, maybe I'm not.
Yeah.
So it's like in your head, you think you're doing it correctly. But yeah, I think if you don't have like something to kind of like mirror yourself or film yourself and kind of really see what you're doing wrong or where you might be tweaking, not standing correctly, like you can really injure yourself.
Absolutely. Yeah. I think despite like social media maybe poo-pooing on filming yourself in a gym sometimes I think it's a safety thing. If you're new to exercise and you're still trying to get comfortable in things and you have an idea of what an exercise should look like because you've seen it on YouTube, Instagram, where you're working with an online coach, film yourself doing it. And that way you can know what you're doing and you can just maybe make some adjustments to get that a little bit better. But I think that's probably my first and foremost thing is just start easy, get comfortable with the basic movements, and then go from there.
Awesome. And then so you do online coaching as well in addition to Monarch. So if people need some support and help and want to work with someone, can you talk a little bit about how you work with people and what your coaching programs are like?
Absolutely. So the online coaching is also in a rehab sense. It started working with primarily like ACL athletes in the later stages of their rehab. So
that's a hard injury to recover from,
right? Yeah. It's a long process. And unfortunately, with just the kind of brackets put on the healthcare system, both from insurance lenses and other things, like a lot of times these kids are being pushed back to sport either like too soon, unprepared, untested. And so that's a big passion of mine. I played field sport athletes. I was lucky enough to not sustain anything super major. But at the same time, I saw it happen to my friends, and then they were pushed back too soon and some of them ended up re-tearing. So that's how it started. It was doing online rehab for them because it looked like a lot of strength conditioning at that point, a lot of using my field sport knowledge and getting it out back on the field and then back in the gym, looking and feeling like an athlete, something that a lot of PT places unfortunately don't do. So that's how it started. And then as I've gotten more comfortable delivering those online services, I've opened it up to people who are either newer to exercise and need just some guidance, want someone in their corner. I think they feel safer with the physical therapist because they know that we know the pain science behind some of it. And it started there. And now I work with anyone who either wants to get back to doing something weekend warrior wise, or I've been in chronic pain. And so usually they reach out, Instagram, DMs, or my website, and we have an assessment call, go from there, make sure that I'm the right fit to work with you, and go from there. And if I'm not good for you, I want to make sure that you have someone else so that I can point you in the right direction to get you back to doing what you want to do. Because there's some people who either have too low of a training age, or maybe some other things going on, some balance deficits, that I don't feel comfortable doing remote sessions with those people, or doing those asynchronous workouts with them. And I want to make sure at least we get a baseline somewhere else, and then maybe we can revisit that down the line. But working with me online is a lot like it is in person. You get full programming, and you get form checks, things like that, either real time or asynchronously via an app. So it's a lot of fun. It frees me up and it helps me work with people all over the country versus just being geographically tied to Los Angeles.
Yeah. And then do you work with anyone in person in LA outside of Monarch as well, or with your own programs, or is it all just remote online?
I have worked with some local soccer players here in LA. I was working with more people in Austin when I was there for 5 years, but both are options. You can come work with me at Monarch. outside my normal working hours, but I'm happy to do so for the people that need it. But then outside that, usually if I'm taking on private clients outside of that, I do an assessment in person, and then we'll kind of see if we can test the waters asynchronously and kind of self-empower you to do things on your own, as you can't stay with me forever.
And do you find people doing it online have as much success as doing it in person? Like you said, like you have them kind of like videotape themselves to be accountable. Like, are people pretty good about sticking with an online program, or what are things that are kind of a hurdle for them in sticking with it?
Absolutely. There's some people who kind of fall off, which is the same thing you see in a normal physical therapy practice, right? Unfortunately, some people, whether it's the programming or whether it's too much or too little, sometimes they think they're ready for a change and they're not quite ready. So
they're not like me. They don't book at 5:30 a.m. 3 weeks out.
Exactly. Not everyone's as dedicated, unfortunately. But I think you see similar results. And again, it takes the right type of person. That's why we have that initial kind of discovery call, is to make sure that they're ready to make that change and that we'd actually be a good pair, because there's no one any good if we're not sticking together for a minimum 3-4 months. So I see success with it. I've had a lot of success with it, and it helps me help more people. But that's not to say it's perfect, right? There's some people who unfortunately slip through the cracks, and we try to hold them accountable via the app and a couple other tools. But
they have to be responsible for their health too, right?
Exactly. They have to take that ownership. And I think that's one of the big things that I try to empower people with, whether it's working with me in person or online. It's just the self-efficacy piece, like showing you what you can do and kind of putting the ownership like in your hands on what you can do and what you can do on your own, that I'm not going to be able to do the work for you, but I'm here to support you and hold you accountable so that you can do the things you want to do.
Absolutely. And so in your practice, you've been a PT for quite a while now. So what's one of your favorite success stories that you've seen with someone that you've worked with?
Probably my favorite was a football player out of Texas. He was a defensive lineman who he unfortunately tore his ACL. And it was a tricky rehab. He tore his ACL. He had a meniscus repair on top of that. And over his Christmas break, when he had traveled with his family, he was probably about 4 or 5 months post-op, and he didn't do anything crazy, but he went to the gym on his own, which I love. But he was with either his brother or his cousin, and pushed it a little bit too much on an exercise that was in a range of motion we weren't quite ready for, and ended up dinging up the meniscus repair, which isn't the end of the world. It's not bad. Does that take
a long time to recover?
Not as long as people think, which is great. But it
too much too soon.
Exactly. It swelled up the knee. It kind of pissed it off a little bit, and we just had the real things in from there, so it delayed the recovery a little bit. But long story short, once we got that taken care of and settled down, we got him back in time for spring football, and I got to watch him play football in the fall, and it was one of the scariest things ever, because it's his first day back, and he didn't tell me he's a D lineman, but he moves really well, incredible athlete, but he was also going to be the punter for the team. And so he gets out there on punt team, and I'm losing my mind. Like, this doesn't look right. The snap is bad. He has to go pick it up and just starts running with the ball, and some kid undercuts his legs, and I'm in the stands freaking out. But he gets up and he's fine. And he ends up having a huge game. He ends up being an all-district player in the state of Texas, which Texas high school football is everything. So it was just really fun to see him get back to doing what he wanted to do, and at a really high level. And that was pretty early on in my career, and that's kind of when I realized I'm in the right place. Like it was really, really fun. And
to see the recovery and get back out there.
And it was a year. It was just over a year before he set foot back on the field.
That's a long recovery.
Long time. So I got to know him really well.
Amazing. Well, Morgan, thank you so much. This was so informative. If people want to find you and learn more about your online coaching programs, what's the best way to find you?
Morganstanley.dpt. Not the other Morgan Stanley, that's the bank. Make sure you put the .dpt in there. Everything's there. Link to my website. If you want to check out Monarch as well, there's a link on my bio there as well. But yeah, that's it.
Yeah, we'll just link to everything in the show notes as well. So thank you so much.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you.
Thanks.